Welcome back to the Career Profiles podcast. I am your host, Sean, and as always, I'm joined by Johnston for another career profile of another great fighter throughout boxing history. A fighter who we have covered before for our Legendary Nights podcast. This is the tale of Emile Griffith, his life, his career, and everything that surrounds his story. This is one that we decided to pick for this season because we really enjoyed our Legendary Nights episode on him with his fights with Benny Perrette, and we felt like there was a lot more to tell of Emile Griffith's story, and there certainly is, and we certainly hope that this episode gives you a real insight into his life, his early beginnings, his journey through boxing, and of course what happens after boxing and how he's looked at upon by his peers within the world of boxing, and also his legacy and what he left behind in the sport. I'm really excited to deliver this episode to you guys, and I really do hope you enjoy it. It's one of the ones that we wanted to do for a while, and I know we say this every time we do an episode, guys, but we really do love certain elements of this sport and these stories that compel us so much to want to do more on them.
Yeah, and this one's definitely one of them. Emile Griffith is an absolute superstar. He was at the time, and he had some difficulties throughout his career, which we're going to highlight throughout this. And he wasn't just a boxer. He was a gentle man, really, a very gentle fighter in a way, not in the ring, but outside of the ring. So, and he had good people around him, which is different as well. So, yeah, as you say, Sean, from the very beginning, from his birth all the way through his boxing career until his death, this is a very difficult story at times. So strap yourselves in and listen up. It's going to be a good one.
So it all begins when he was born, Emile Alphonse Griffith, in Charlotte, Emile, the largest city on St. Thomas, part of the United States Virgin Islands, on February the 3rd, 1938. He was one of 8 children, 3 brothers and 4 sisters, to father Emile Sr. and mother Imelda. He was just like any other kid. He went to school, he did his chores around the house, swam in the sea, played baseball, and occasionally stole fruit with his friends for fun. Then one day, his mother told them that their daddy had gone to New York City and wouldn't be coming back. Emile struggled to come to terms with the fact that his father had abandoned him, his brothers and sisters. He would dream of his father's return, which never came. He suffered internally, never allowed to speak of his father's sudden disappearance, and it affected him. Life was difficult for the family. Imelda struggled to provide for her children, so money and food was rationed until she found work. When she did, the lives of the Griffith family would change forever, and Emile would feel that abandoned feeling once again. Imelda was a terrific cook, so when she was offered the chance to become the official cook for the governor of Puerto Rico in San Juan, she was stuck between a rock and a hard place. The job was 80 miles away. Not too far, but it might as well have been on the other side of the world, because visits back home would be limited to every 3 or 4 months. Emile, only 10 years old, and Imelda were troubled. It was only when Imelda's mother and sisters insisted that they would look after her, then 5 children, that she agreed to leave. At first, while Emile lived with his grandmother, it wasn't so bad, but when she fell ill, he had to move in with his cousin Blanche.
And that was a real change in his life, really. So not yet a teenager, his cousin treated him like a dog. She in the cottage with her 2 children, and his arrival threw her into a fury. Blanche made him work as if he was a man twice his age. Emile's day started at dawn when he carried a metal drum down the mountain so that he could fill it up with fresh water, which he would then haul back up the steep hill. He was also responsible for the yard and getting the kids to school, to and from school, and whenever he made a mistake or did not clean the house or polish the floors until they were beautifully shiny, Blanche punished him. If it was not the belt being used to a point where blooded wheels were raised on his flesh, It was the torture of being made to hold 2 cinder blocks above his head. The torture was just too much to bear. So one day when he was 12, he ran away from his cousin's house and he ended up hiding in the woods. While in the woods, a man unexpectedly appeared, sneaking up behind Emile, which startled him. The mystery man claimed to be his uncle, but Emile thought it was strange that he had never met him before in his life and began to wonder if this man was who he said he was at all. This stranger with a gold tooth would just laugh off Emile's questioning and then lure him back to his isolated shack. When they arrived, Emile's curiosity soon turned to fear when he realised that they were all alone. He tried to make excuses that his cousin Blanche would get mad for not returning home to complete his chores, but the man just laughed and then refused to let him leave.
When Emile tried to escape, he was unable to wrestle himself free. The man was just too strong. The sick, twisted pervert then directed young Emile towards the only bed in the shack, suggesting they both rest. Again, author Donald McRae explains what happened next, and he wrote, "He held Emile tight and lay down with him. Emile closed his eyes, pretending to sleep. His hands crawled across Emile's body like giant scuttling spiders. They scared Emile, and he attempted to break free. There was no chance of an escape, and with the man whispering hoarsely, Emile lay very still. The big rough hands kept moving, dipping down from beneath his shirt to places that Emile knew they did not belong. He felt dirty and wanted to cry when the man touched him inside his shorts. Emile was overpowered and made to do things he did not really understand. He thought he might die in that stinking shack, for he was helpless until it was over. It was only then that as the man rolled away from him, he could slip off the bed. Emile pulled on his clothes, biting his lip to stop the tears from falling. He turned quickly when, as if walking from madness, the man pressed some coins into his hand and told him to buy himself some sweets. Emile ran for his life. He threw away the coins in the woods because they made him feel sick. He never spoke a word of this ordeal. It was something that he actually kept a secret, which of course made him withdraw as a child. He never returned to the woods. Instead, he hung around town during his spare time. He became intrigued with the juvenile prison, Mandal. The sound of kids playing made him believe they were safer in those steel gates than out of the streets or at home with his cousin Blanche.
One day he managed to talk to one of the kids through the gates of the reform school. "They get beaten in Mandal?" he asked. "Nah, not much," was the reply. "Did you get fed?" Emile inquired. "Yeah," replied the boy. "Did they have lots of friends?" "Of course." "So the place was okay?" "Yeah, sometimes." Well, days later, and Emile ran away from his cousin's house again and stood at the front gate of Mandal, asking if he could live there. Confused, they asked if he had committed a crime. He shook his head, no. The supervisor found it quite amusing, so actually drove him back to inform his cousin of what had happened. Blanche was furious, so she beat Emile with a belt and then made him hold them cinder blocks above his head for longer than usual. Still, Emile made that trip back to Mandel a few days later. This time, it was a cry for help. The man listened to his story, was sympathetic, but couldn't help. Instead, he gave a bowl of chowder and then took him back home to the cottage. This beating, the time was even worse. The cinder blocks felt heavier than they ever did before. Then one day, his sister Joyce stepped on a large garden fork that went straight through her foot, and Emile came running to the rescue. He ran all the way to Mandel with his sister on his back, where she was treated by a nurse there. While he rested, Emile, covered in blood and sweat, he removed his shirt. That was when the supervisor and the nurse discovered the extent of his cousin's barbaric abuse. His scars were evident on his back. They decided to intervene and keep him at the home while Blanche wrote to Imelda. Obviously, she's covering herself, and the letter explained that Emile had gone crazy, so his mother raced home to aid her son.
When she discovered that Emile was in a juvenile prison, she thought her cousin may have been right. However, the supervisor explained that he had not done anything wrong, and if she could not look after him, then he would prefer to live at Mandal. Imelda agreed for him to remain in the reformatory while she worked in Puerto Rico. Emile enjoyed the routine and structure, and soon began to excel. He made friends with the other inmates, and as he began to feel more at home, his personality would filter through, and so would his sexuality. Some knew that Emile was homosexual. It was obvious to some. We're sure it was never discussed as openly as what it would be today, but of course it wouldn't in those times. Feeling more comfortable in his surroundings, Emile was able to express himself, which was great for him after such a really traumatic start in his life. However, this came with its own difficulties, when a bigger boy tried to force himself onto Emile in the showers. Those horrific feelings of the man in the woods came flooding back to him, but this time he was able to fight back. He beat his attacker until he made him cry. He was never bothered again by the bully boy, and Emile was left alone to embrace his young life and his sexuality while at Mandal. This is where young Griffith learned how to live a double life, because society forced him to. Same-sex relationships was a criminal act in every state of America, and it carried a potential prison sentence for those found guilty of between 2 and 20 years, with additional fines of up to $2,000. It was even illegal for two men to dance together, and was still considered to be a mental illness. During these years, Emile would spend most of his time at Mandal, but when his mother came home to visit, he would stay with her and his grandmother.
On a trip to San Juan to see Imelda, he was shocked to discover that she had married Antonio Castillo and now had 3 stepchildren. Their marriage did not last long, for reasons unknown, but when Imelda suddenly announced that she was leaving Puerto Rico and Antonio for New York City, Emile was relieved after spending 4 years at Mandal. Relieved that he would be with his family again, eventually, and that maybe, just maybe, his mum and dad might get back together. Well, in 1955, Imelda would send for each of her children in turn, and Emile Jr., being the eldest, was the first she summoned. It was a sight for sore eyes when he was greeted by his father at LaGuardia Airport. He had not seen him for 6 years, and his mother and dad were actually back together. It was a dream come true. However, it never lasted, because once again, Emile Sr. would disappear, often when the rent was due at their Harlem apartment. They lived together for a short period, but then his dad moved out permanently. Junior would visit his dad at the garage where he worked as a mechanic as often as possible, but it was always brief and underwhelming. Not long after Emile had arrived in New York, he met a sweet and pretty girl from his old neighborhood in Harlem, and her name was Esther Taylor. They officially met in a church when he was 17 and she was 15. Esther was immediately smitten with Emile, and their families knew each other also, so it was only natural that they would start dating. Emile, by all accounts, was a tremendous dancer. Esther even called him a fabulous dancer, and he was always fun to be around, but Esther would always play second fiddle to his boyfriends and his other life. She only knew that her boyfriend was, as she always said, a real busy person. She sort of almost accepted the fact that it was a part of their relationship.
While in the early stages of their partnership, Emile got a job working at a hat factory thanks to his cousin, Idigo Lambert. One of Emile's secret ambitions was to be a ladies' hat designer, so when he was offered the job of $40 a week to work at the factory, owned by Howie Albert, he saw this as a stepping stone into the career of hat designing. However, it ended up being a stepping stone into a career that Emile had never considered. The story of how Emile found himself in boxing is now stuff of legend, and we did mention this in our Legendary Nights episode, The Tale of Griffith versus Perret, but we must tell it again. Now, while he was working on the shop floor during the summer of 1956, 18-year-old Emile got permission from his cousin to remove his shirt. He revealed a 26-inch waist, a muscled 44-inch chest, which got the female hat packers in a sweat. Mr. Albert had never recognised Emile before, but witnessing his female workers becoming flustered and giggly, he went over to see what all the fuss was about. When he saw the young strapping man working away without any idea that people were looking, he asked if he had done any boxing, and Emile said, "Sure," smiling at the question. Howie asked, "Where?" expecting to hear the names of Stillmans or Gleasons. Emile spread his arms wide, and with a matching grin he said, "Right here, boss," thinking he actually meant boxing up the ladies' hats and not boxing the sport. Howie lifted his fist in a boxer's pose. "Oh," Emile said in disappointment. "That boxing." Howie convinced him to give it a try, and after a few casual workouts in the stockroom, Emile impressed his boss. In fact, he was so impressed that Howie decided to enter the 1957 Golden Gloves tournament at Madison Square Garden, without even breathing a word to Emile that he was going to do this.
Well, then one day he was actually summoned by letter to the Daily News office for a medical examination. And Emile, well, he was in a bit of a panic, and he called his mum. He said, "Mummy, I think I'm being drafted." When he turned up for his physical, he was surprised to discover that the medical was for a boxing tournament, and that he had, well, a boxer he'd never heard of. He suspected that Howie was behind the whole thing, and his suspicions were confirmed on the next day when his boss presented him with a pair of boxing trunks. Emile responded angrily. He didn't want to be a fighter, he wanted to be a hat designer. Instead, he was more interested in those flowery bonnets and elegant hats. Howie changed his mind when he informed him that all the female colleagues that obviously got flustered when they see him put their money together to buy him the shorts. Well, Emile reluctantly accepted, saying that he'd give it a try, just for the sake of the girls. The sly boss immediately sent him to Gil Clancy, a friend of his, at 28th Street Park's department gym, to get him ready for the Golden Gloves in just a few months. At first, Emile got beaten up in sparring by a pro called Roger Harvey, but he was determined, and after listening closely to Clancy, he was soon fighting Harvey on equal terms. Just as impressed with Emile as Howie was, and with limited training, Clancy took him to Madison Square Garden for the Golden Gloves novice finals on February 18th, 1957. Emile proved that Howie had an eye for talent, reaching the final, where he lost a very narrow decision against Charles Womley. Watching on the crowd that night was his good friend Calvin Thomas, who was accompanied by Bobby Miles, cousin of Ezard Charles. Emile's good friend Calvin was never around to train with him. Instead, he was what Griffith liked to call my running buddy.
As they would run around Times Square along 42nd Street in secret outside the Port Authority bus terminal, a well-known hotspot of the gay community, men would shout out, "Faggot," or call them fucking fairies as they made their way to the local club. They were always super cautious, making sure they were never spotted, but at the moments they were discovered, very few men had ever had the bollocks to insult Emile due to his muscular physique. The same went for Calvin, whose short and fat appearance was actually deceiving. He was identified as the easier target, but although a colourful character and also fun to be around, Calvin also carried a lead pipe in his bag. Emile once saw him reach for the pipe when a homophobe tried to taunt him. Calvin shouted, "You want to fight?" pulling out his bat. Well, the guy crapped himself and backed down fast. Calvin was Emile's best friend and protector, who loved boxing. He knew the sport better than Emile in the early days and taught himself while hanging around at the city's best boxing gyms, especially Gleason's, where Benny Kid Perrette trained. No one from Gleason's gym ever said a word to Calvin about his sexuality, even though they knew his so-called secret. They even allowed him to man the front door and collect the monthly fees. But most of the time, Calvin just ran with Emile. 1 year on from his Golden Gloves final defeat, Emile became the National Golden Gloves welterweight champion. Straight after capturing his Golden Gloves, Emile Griffith turned professional on June 2nd, 1958, winning a 4-round decision against Joe Parham, and Emile, well, he was on his way, with his 2 white mentors guiding him.
Gary Smith of Sports Illustrated explained what boxing did for Emile. It gave him money for the first time and enabled him, after each pro fight, to fly one more of his 7 siblings up from the Caribbean to New York City and attempt to recreate something that exploded in his childhood. After Emile clocked up another 3 victories on the bounce, taking his professional record to 4-0, all on points by the way, his girlfriend Esther became a bookkeeper at Manhattan. It was a solid and respectable job and a real achievement for a 20-year-old black woman, and Emile enjoyed boasting about her. His girlfriend, who worked in the Manhattan office, was even more incredible to him than him becoming a professional boxer. Following his first knockout win over Sergio Rios, Emile was on a Teddy Brenner card at St. Nick's on West 66th Street, and he knocked out Larry Jones in 5 rounds. Emile soon became the Madison Square Garden matchmaker's favourite young fighter after just 12 professional contests. Brenner knew he could depend on Griffith's technical excellence, his stamina and his punch resistance to keep the fans happy and paying all the time. So it was no surprise when Emile fought his 13th professional fight at Madison Square Garden, where he picked up a 10-round decision over Kid Fashik from Cuba. That night he shared the card with the headline act, who was actually Benny Kid Paret, who was beaten by Gaspar Ortega, but would become the world welterweight champion in less than a year. Emile's next opponent was an American called Randy Sandy. I mean, what a cracking name. And it was held at the Academy of Music in Manhattan in front of a crowd of just under 1,500 fans. The New York Times reported that Griffith scored in the middle rounds, but Sandy was strong in the 8th and 9th round, as Emile fell to his first professional loss by a split decision.
Following back-to-back wins, Emile was given the opportunity to fight in front of his first television audience on February the 12th, 1960, at the Garden against Gaspar Ortega. At the press conference before the fight, Griffith brought a dozen women's hats and popped one on Ortega's head for the cameras. The picture was released by the Associated Press with the caption underneath saying, "Rest easy, America, this hat maker is no sissy." The 21-year-old Griffith produced a satisfactory performance to take a split decision over the experienced Mexican in his first main event at Madison Square Garden. His superior speed made a difference against a man who was ranked number 8 in the welterweight division. Emile fought twice at the Garden in the space of weeks, defeating Denny Moyer by split decision in a very close fight which received calls for a rematch. Within just 1 month, the fight was moved to the Pacific Livestock Pavilion in Portland, Oregon. Once again, it was a really close fight where Emile demonstrated his explosive power but was unable to finish off Moyer. The verdict was another split decision, but this time it went in favour of Moyer. Emile recovered from his second career defeat with a split decision victory over the Argentinian Jorge Jose Fernandez back at the St. Nick's Arena. Explained by the United Press International as an excellent fight throughout. Griffith had the faster hands while Fernandez was more of the heavier puncher. When the cards were announced, it was reported that the crowd booed the decision for more than 5 minutes, and angry Latin American fans broke chairs and threw them in the ring. But police finally brought order to the arena. Griffith was clearly given a favourable decision, with only one sports writer giving the fight to Griffith out of the 13 writing about the fight.
Sounds a bit nuts, doesn't it? However, Emile felt like he did enough, and he said, "I know I won, and I'll prove it any time he wants to fight me again, next week if necessary." Well, Teddy Brenner was actually hoping to match the winner with Benny Paret in a non-title fight at the Garden on July 12, 1960. But he now had to agree an immediate rematch due to the controversy of the decision. Although it derailed the possibility of an earlier Paret fight, Emile Griffith was eager to put that controversial victory against Jorge Jose Fernandez to rest. And that's exactly what he did. And the Associated Press wrote, Emile Griffith showed dazzling footwork and speed of hand, winning a unanimous decision over Fernandez in a non-televised match at MSG. There were no knockdowns in this hard-fought rematch. The New Yorker jumped into an early lead, prancing around the ring, and then opening up with a quick combinations. After the 6th round, Fernandez lost the initiative to Griffith, who began to speed it up again. All three judges scored the fight to Emile Griffith, who now had a record of 19-2 with 5 knockouts. Teddy Brenner then gave Gil Clancy a chilling message in the summer of 1960. I want to make Griffith with Florento Fernandez. Fernandez, Clancy replied, are you kidding? According to Ortega, who lost to Fernandez in 1959, his eyes said, I'm going to kill you. So he's a bit of a scary looking individual, this Fernandez. And in his hometown of Havana, Fernandez was actually revered as El Barbado del Knockout for his left hook, which resembled a small firebomb device. I love these names they put out of their hats here. Well, Brenner actually promised Clancy that if Griffith beat Fernandez, he could then avoid another dangerous Cuban fighter in the undefeated Luis Rodriguez, another hard hitter, who was far more skilled than Fernandez. Well, after studying the tapes, Gil Clancy visualized a plan to defuse the big hitter Fernandez. He noticed that his blows came swinging in from out wide.
He identified that if Griffith just stepped inside with a jab and some swift combinations, his speed and skill would allow him to avoid Fernandez's biggest punches. Emile trusted his trainer's plan. Okay, Clancy, you're the boss, he replied. When they stepped into the ring at the Garden on August 25, 1960, Emile Griffith was well prepared and ready to entertain the crowd. That Florentino Fernandez barely landed a punch and was busted up comprehensively. Emile staggered the Cuban with a right to the chin in the first round, which opened a cut on his left eyebrow. A frustrated Fernandez was then docked a point for 2 low blows in the second and again in the 5th for persistent holding. However, Emile was badly rocked in the 6th, but he managed to survive the round and come back in the 7th to bust open his opponent's lip and chin. Hurt again in the 9th, Emile managed to show excellent recovery skills as well as the terrific ability to box and nullify a dangerous puncher. The result was a formality at the final bell as Emile took a unanimous decision. Brenner could hardly contain himself and he urged Clancy, "Now you got to fight Rodriguez." Clancy was shocked and yelled, "What do you mean?" Brenner was so in awe of the performance by Griffith that he no longer feared Rodriguez one bit. But before that fight could happen, Brenner needed a durable opponent. So he opted for the South African Willie Towell for the headline fight at the Garden. Towell was remembered for his bout against 21-year-old and fellow native Hubert Esako on March 19, 1956 for the South African featherweight title. Esako sustained fatal brain injuries in the fight and actually died 52 hours after losing to Towell by an 11th round knockout. Emile and Willie met for the first time at a restaurant on East 53rd Street to conclude the deal.
Well, during the negotiations, Emile was asked how he felt about facing a killer in the ring. Emile replied innocently, "I don't worry about nothing like that. Willie and me will put on a great show. Don't forget, it's date night at the Garden." Willie smiled at Emile's remark, which was a reference to Teddy Brenner's headlining of the fight called Date Night, a new program of Saturday fights where women were allowed into the arena free of charge, only as long, obviously, back in these days, they had to be accompanied by a male escort. Emile then asked, "Do you like to dance, Willie?" And Alan Towell, his brother and trainer, snapped back, "I'll answer that. Willie's a brilliant dancer." "But Emile, you won't be in the mood for dancing at the end of this date." Emile laughed, and then before Alan could continue, Willie jumped in. "I am. I love to dance," he said. "Me too, champ," Emile chimed in. Underwhelmed with the niceties, Brenner said, "This is too friendly for my taste. These boys are coming to the Garden to fight." That was when the questions returned to the death of Herbert Essekow, and Willie was asked by reporters what it felt like to have actually killed a man. And Willie responded in a sombre and touching statement. He said, "I think of Herbert every day. I said mass for him again this morning. I'd do the same tomorrow." Emile refused to trash talk, clearly noticing his demons were still raw. Instead, he consoled his opponent. "Hey champ, we're nearly done," he said. The fight was signed and agreed for October the 22nd, 1960, and Emile left the table at 3 that afternoon with his tight-knit group of Howie Albert, Gil Clancy and Calvin Thomas. It was a big fight because the winner was now assured of a chance to fight the new world welterweight champion that is, Benny Kid Paret. So Emile and Clancy, they headed off to the gym.
For the weigh-in, Terrell was killing time at the New York State Athletic Commission office, looking at a newspaper advertisement that showed the young South African singer Miriam Makeba. And Emile popped into the office and with a chuckle peered over Willie's shoulder. "She's pretty, champ." Willie looked up in surprise. "Do you like her?" Now in these days, speaking like that about a girl from a different race was forbidden, and in South Africa, a man could even be locked up for saying such a thing. Emile replied with a smile. "Relax, champ." Now the weigh-in took place at noon, and Willie had stripped down to his underpants, and then he felt a hand pat his right bum cheek. It was Emile, who then said, "You're in shape, champ." He was flustered by the cheek of his opponent, but when Emile wished him good luck, Willie replied, "Yeah, you too." Terrell scaled in 3 pounds under the weight, and Emile followed just in his trunks and weighed 147, bang on. Teddy Brenner said, "Gentlemen, we've got a date in the Garden tonight." Now the fight was aired on ABC as part of a new partnership with the Garden, and the famous announcer Don Dunphy introduced the retired undefeated heavyweight champion of the world, Rocky Marciano, to the audience before the fight. Now into the actual fight itself, and the first 3 rounds were evenly matched, with Griffith's combinations countered by Terrell's slick jab and occasional right hand. However, 15 seconds into the 4th, and Emile followed up a lovely combination with a peach of a right hand. The South African went down in a heap, the force of the blow making his black hair fly up on his head as he landed on the canvas with a thump, but he managed to survive.
He did, and during the break before the 7th, Clancy actually urged Griffith to get him out of there. The rally call worked because Emile came out firing and connected with a left and a fierce right to score a second knockdown. But Willie Terrell held on until the end of the bell once again. In the 8th, and Terrell was pinned against the ropes when a right cross and a left hook to the body dropped him for a 3rd time, and then down again just as the bell rang again, Saved by the Bell. So Willie Terrell made it back to his corner, but he was soon joined by the ringside physician, who gestured to the referee, "Look, it's over," and it was done. Fight over, Emile won the fight. After the fight, Emile Griffith visited his opponent's dressing room after the win, and he said, "I'm sorry, champ." The two actually shared the dressing room while they got changed, and were even greeted by Rocky Marciano, who came in to offer his condolences and his congratulations. Emile embraced his beaten opponent by kissing him on the cheek, and Willie replied, "Thank you, champ." Now, you may be thinking why we are going to the level of detail onto this fight that didn't really have any significance in the ring, but it had a huge significance in explaining what Emile was like as a person and a sportsman, and what would happen later on in his career. He was compassionate outside the ring before and after, but was as ferocious as ever during the 24 minutes that they shared in the ring together. They had little in common at this point, but they would share the same demons in just over two years' time. Willie Terrell, at the age of 26, was done as a fighter. He would never box again after this. The demons of Herbert Ezekiel were just too unbearable. And after the fight, Emile kissed his girlfriend goodbye, climbed into a taxi with Calvin, and headed for Times Square, where they painted the town red.
By now, Emile was on his way to becoming famous, and so Esther gave him space to continue enjoying himself with other men. She believed that eventually they would be together forever. But for Emile, although he loved her in his own way and liked being around her, she also provided him with cover. She was the person who removed doubts of Emile's sexuality. I mean, how can he be gay? Didn't he have a girlfriend? A foxy, young, intelligent, sweet-hearted from Harlem? He can't be gay. This is what many would say, as they tried to convince themselves. His two mentors and father figure in his life, Howie Albert and Gil Clancy, well, they were not naive. They knew he was gay, but they made damn sure his secret was never uncovered. Clancy was the type that didn't want to know. He turned a blind eye to it, quite literally too. His left eye had been left impaired after a bit of steel from a drill flew into his face when he was just 3 years old. Clancy just simply ignored the rumours circling around Emile's sexuality. But Howie was different. He always felt he was able to talk to Emile about his latest friend, usually a Hispanic boy who would turn up to watch sparring. Howie disliked the hypocrisy of society and would issue Emile and Calvin the odd quiet warning that they should be careful, but he did not question his fighter's sexuality. His younger brother Franklin disapproved of Emile's lifestyle. His sister Gloria, the second eldest, accepted him and even teased Emile playfully about his boyfriends. His mother was a lot like Clancy and ignored the truth. However, Imelda did meet some of his friends who were more out there with their sexuality than his best friend Calvin, but she never mentioned his sexuality at all.
Imelda was always at her son's fights, and she was screaming all night. Every fight she did this, even at the Garden against Willie Terrell, who actually asked Emile about his mother, and he replied, "Mummy can't help it, it's just as she was." Imelda was never far from Emile's side, ever, throughout his whole life. So much so that he allowed her to pretty much just get away with murder, as she continually pushed her way in between her son and Esther. There was jealousy and resentment whenever Emile tried to spoil Esther. He would buy her a gift, but even before he could give it to her, it would be seized on by his mother. And when he spoke about taking Esther away for a fight, or after a fight, Imelda quickly moved in. She needed a holiday. He should take her away first, and he would allow it to happen unaware of his mother's manipulation at the time and its impact it had on the girl that he loved in his own way. Imelda and the rest of the family would also take a huge share of Emile's fighting purse. In fact, he fought for them. His sister Gloria was the only one who tried to persuade him not to give away everything he had earned to his mother, or their mother, and others. But Emile shrugged. He loved them, and there would always be another fight and another big payday. Those paydays stacked up nicely in the first 8 months of 1960, fighting 7 times in 8 months. Now it was time to face the other dangerous Cuban, as in Florento Rodriguez, and Brenner saw the spin that he could use to promote the fight. The gorgeous hat maker against the ugly one would sell out the Garden, and ABC television executives would love the contrasting character. Emile was a disciplined fighter in general, but especially for this one, preparing for Rodriguez. So he stopped his trips to Times Square and trained in Queens, staying very close to Esther.
Angelo Dundee, who trained Rodriguez, said he had never seen a fighter with hands as quick as the Cuban, and that included Muhammad Ali and Sugar Ray Leonard throughout their astonishing careers. Not only was he quick, Dundee had taught him how to plant feet to make his fast blows incredibly powerful too. He had a very impressive 35-0 record that intimidated Emile to the point that his hands trembled while Gil wrapped them before the fight. He looked carefully at his fighter out of his one working eye, and he asked him quietly, "You okay, Emile?" To which Emile nodded. Clancy looked down and continued his work. He had never known Emile to look and act scared before. Clancy didn't like it when the wise guys joked about Emile being a fairy behind his back. There was nothing fairy-like about him in the ring. He was a brave and accomplished fighter, and so eventually he said to Emile, "He's not that ugly either. It's only a nickname. Rodriguez is just a man like you." When he finally confronted Rodriguez in the ring, a clear thought entered his mind, and he would later describe it and said, "I calmed down, and when I saw that chunky Cuban coming at me, I thought, well, this is it, Emile. You've got to stand up and be counted, or get wiped off the face of the earth." During the fight, you could hear Imelda screaming loudly, "Junior! Junior! Get him, Junior!" On December the 17th, 1960, Emile Griffith faced the Ugly One in a close fight, marred by much clinching, but it was Emile who forced the fight. After 10 rounds, the fight went to the scorecards, with the referee, Mark Conn, having it 5-4, with one even, to Emile Griffith.
After announcer Johnny Addy called the first card, he then shouted down the microphone. Judge Bill Reach had it 6-4. He looked as if he was going to point to Rodriguez, but then suddenly his hand gestured dramatically to the other direction for Griffith. An exuberant Emile Griffith jumped straight into Clancy's arms while Addy, having ended the drama, shouted out. The other judge, Tony Castellano, had it 5-4, one even for Rodriguez. It was a formality. I mean, it didn't matter. Emile knew that some people mocked him as a faggot before the fight and in the streets, but he had shown the Garden once again that he was a fighter and that the world title beckoned for him. The world title opportunity finally arrived on April Fool's Day in 1961 at the Convention Center in Miami Beach, Florida, against Cuba's only world champion and betting favourite, Benny Kid Paret. Now, we have been through not just this fight, but all three of their encounters between Emile Griffith and Benny Kid Paret in our brilliant Legendary Night episode, so please go back and listen to that for more details. But we will, however, explain the key moments throughout their three-fight rivalry before we continue with Emile's boxing story and career. Now, before the fight, Pat Putnam in the Miami Herald ironically called Emile the Cuban Killer because he had already conquered Kid Fichique, Florento Fernandez and Luis Rodriguez. Benny Paret was next. Words that must haunt Pat Putnam now, I'm sure of it. Now, while Emile prepared for Benny Paret in Miami, he was fortunate enough to bump into Cassius Clay, who encouraged him. And he actually said to him, if you can beat the ugly one, as in Rodriguez, who was his stablemate at the time, who is so damn fine, he said, you could beat anyone. And Emile just replied, thanks, champ. Champ, Clay replied, now you're talking. Of course, he wasn't the champion at that time, not quite yet. So Emile weighed in at 145.5 pounds for the first bout, while Benny scaled 146.5 pounds. Emile's mother and his cousin, Bernard Forbes, were both sat at ringside, being just as loud as the Cuban band, who were eager to greet their world champion into the ring.
The New York Times described the action from the 13th round, and they wrote, the two fighters came out for the 13th round working furiously to the body. Referee Jimmy Peerless separated them near Paret's corner, and then Emile threw a long left hook that caught the champion flush on the jaw. The champion reeled back, badly hurt, and Griffith roared in with a solid right hand that spun Paret around. Another left hook dropped him near Griffith's corner, where he lay at full length, while Peerless told the count of 10. Before the stoppage, Griffith was taking a beating, so it was a surprise when he came away the victor. Emile explained that Clancy slapped me in the face in the corner just before the 13th round started. That's what woke me up. I was looking for a decision, but when I saw the opening, I let go. The Times wrote, Emile Griffith, 22, with a heart of steel, knocked out Benny Kid Paret in the 13th round to win the World Welterweight Championship before a national television audience. Don Dunphy cornered Griffith and Clancy for an interview, and Griffith spoke first and said, thank you, it was a very great fight. Dunphy asked, what do you think about Benny Kid Paret? And his response, he's a good boy. Paret approached him quietly, and Griffith kissed him on the cheek. Dunphy asked, Emile, any plans? Have you got a return match in your contract? Clancy responded and said, we'll give Benny a return match. We think he's a good, tough fighter. He was a good champion, and we'll be glad to give him a return. Emile and his team celebrated until the early hours of Sunday morning at Jimmy Grippo's nightclub on Miami Beach. Emile's championship purse helped him to buy a new house for all of his family.
Yeah, and that included his mum, Gloria, Franklin, his two other sisters, Eleanor and Joyce, his step-brother and step-sister, as well as Gloria's 5 children, whose husband, sadly Wilfred, a friend of Emile's as well, actually was shot dead in Harlem. Now, Griffith went on to knock out Gaspar Ortega in 12 rounds and then take a 10-round decision 2 months before the Perret rematch. A week before the rematch, Emile was 6 pounds over the 147-pound welterweight limit, so he spent much of that week starving himself. Clancy only allowed him to suck on ice cubes all morning before the weigh-in. The usual quartet of Emile, Gil and Howie and Calvin was expanded by the old assistant trainer Sid Martin, Emile's cousin Bernard Forbes again, and surprisingly Emile Griffith's special friend Matthew. Now at the weigh-in, Perret weighed in at 146 and Emile was 147 bang on again. He took his shirt from Matthew and then pulled it over his head and then offered a hand to Benny Perret. The Cuban hesitated and then without looking at him, he shook his wrist mockingly. You could cut the atmosphere with a knife. It was dead quiet until a roar of laughter came from Benny Perret's side of the room. He was acting up in front of his team, portraying the emotions of a camp man. The Spanish reporters asked Perret what he was doing, and so he mimicked the tone of Griffith's soft voice and said the word Maricon, Maricon, which meant in Spanish, faggot. Now Perret turned and looked straight at Griffith with his hand on his hip and mocked him. Emile was completely embarrassed and he felt humiliated. Apart from his brother Franklin, no one had ever dared ridicule him openly like that before. Emile pulled on his street clothes, told Gil and Howie that he needed to eat, he needed to get away. Okay, Emile, Clancy said quietly. Let's get out of here.
Bob Jackson, a New York City trainer, said, "We're like the police, the blue wall. There's a code. We might talk among ourselves about it, but nobody will talk in public about something like that. Nobody, except a desperate man." Even Sugar Ray Robinson said, "It was irreconcilable to be homosexual and a world champion. As long as he was beating the shit out of people, it gave lie to the slander. You couldn't confirm it. You couldn't deny it. You just had to put it over there." Now, on September the 30th, 1961, at Madison Square Garden in New York, 23-year-old Emile Griffith, now 25 and 2, defended his title against Benny Perret, a year older. Their grudge looked even more bruising in the Garden, and their faces were evident of that as both were marked up. Griffith's right eye had a small mouse of a swelling, but Benny's face looked far worse. He was puffy around both eyes, blood wept slowly from just below his left eye, and inside his mouth had also bled steadily from the 4th round on. Emile Griffith explained pretty much how the fight went, and he said, "I just went after him. He was coming after me, and we were punching each other like crazy." Even though 18 out of 22 newspapermen at ringside gave the verdict to Griffith, Benny Perret was actually given the verdict by split decision. Emile Griffith was gutted with the decision, but like a real man, he returned to the ring to congratulate the new world champion as Perret nodded and grinned. Years later, Gil Clancy gave his assessment on Emile's performance and he said, "I thought Emile fought a lazy fight, but I still thought that he had the fight won, but he left it in the hands of the judges when there was no reason to do so."
Don Dumfrey brought Perret and his manager, Alfaro, who acted as a translator in front of the ABC cameras for the post-fight interview. And Dumfrey asked, "Is there a return bout in the contract?" Alfaro shook his head. "No, there is no return bout contract. We can fight anyone we want." And Dumfrey inquired, "Well, will you fight Griffith?" And Alfaro replied on behalf of Perret, "I do not have to fight him, but if they pay me well, I will fight anyone." Emile and his corner looked majorly disappointed. He and his team had both insisted that they would happily give Benny Perret a rematch, so it would have seemed only fair that a rubber match should happen next. Alfaro and Perret were even more bullish when they got out of the ring. They actually heard Gil Clancy talking angrily We were robbed without a gun, apparently, he said. As the press swarmed around Alfaro and Perret, informing them that the overwhelming majority believed that Emile had won the fight, the Cubans just laughed. Someone from the press asked, "Any chance you'll give Emile Griffith the rematch he deserves?" Perret grinned while Alfaro replied, "Nowhere, no how, no place." Eventually, Benny Perret would have no choice but to give Emile Griffith a rematch because the fans would demand a decider. Emile rarely left the house. In fact, he hardly stepped out of his bedroom as he struggled to overcome his defeat. He was absolutely just devastated by it. It was Calvin and Esther who were by his side throughout his self-pity, not because others didn't want to be there for him, but because they were the only two he wanted to see. Imelda cooked all his favourite meals, but Emile couldn't eat much, and he even smiled less. Imelda urged him to go see Clancy. Imelda insisted, "Go on, Junior. Clancy will tell you what to do."
Griffith then fought 3 times in Bermuda, St. Nick's, and a homecoming fight in Charlotte Amalie on St. Thomas in early February 1962. He won all 3, one by knockout and the other 2 on points. With Esther now fading into the background, a guest moved permanently into Emile's house on Colfax Street in Queens. Matthew told his uncle that Emile had adopted him. It was difficult for anyone to believe that Emile, at 24, could be an adoptive father to a boy just 6 years younger than him. But some kind of explanation was needed to justify a teenager moving into the home. He would also still see Esther occasionally because they had known each other for so long. His brother Franklin constantly broke his balls about Matthew, which hurt Emile, but he now had to stop being seen with him in public because the title decider with Perret at Madison Square Garden on March 24, 1962, had been signed. He trained at the Catskills, burying himself into training, and also accepted Clancy and Howie's suggestion that Matthew does not visit him while focusing on getting himself ready for Perret. The Cuban welterweight champion had taken a severe beating by Gene Fullmer in his last fight, and his head throbbed for weeks afterwards. Alfaro, his manager, waved away suggestions that Benny should see a doctor or have his brain x-rayed. In the week leading up to the decider, the press gathered at Perret's training camp, and Alfaro again spoke as the translator and said, "I hate this kind of guy. A fighter's got to look and talk and act like a man. What kind of fighter wears the kind of clothes Griffith does? What kind of fighter talks like that? What kind of fighter hangs around with the people he does?"
Alfaro then mockingly flopped a limp wrist at the reporters, making them laugh, and spelling out his meaning without saying the words that you could not print in 1962. Benny Perret continued talking in Spanish, where I come from, it's important to be a proper man and a proper fighter. When I was a kid, I wanted to be like Kid Gavilan. He was a real fighter, and more than anything else, he was a real man. He knocked out men and loved women. Well, Dr. Alexander Schiff of the New York State Athletic Commission saw no health-related problems, so Emile Griffith and Benny Perret were declared fit. On the day of the weigh-in, everything seemed to be running along smoothly. That was until Emile stepped on the scales. Clancy shouted, "Watch out," but it was too late. Benny had already slipped behind him, and he started sort of wriggling his body, thrusting his pelvis and grabbing Emile by his arse. I mean, you know what he's doing there. Emile turned round and Benny Perret waved a finger at Emile, reached out to touch him, and spoke in his language, his own language. Griffith understood some Spanish. "Hey, Maricon, I'm going to get you and your husband." So he's basically really antagonising him now, and the Cuban's corner roared with laughter. Emile was getting a bit pissed off, and he was just about to hit Perret, but Clancy dived between the two fighters, and he said, "Save it for tonight." He begged him. Emile managed to relax and left in a calm manner, but his blood was still racing. Howard Tuckner of the New York Times tried to report cautiously that the challenger had been subjected to a slur about his sexuality. He then discovered that the Times sub-editors had actually replaced the offensive word, which couldn't be written, homosexual, with a meaningless phrase of unman, and Tuckner shouted out in disbelief to his closest associate, who was Pete Hamill. He said, "Unman? What the fuck is an unman? A butterfly is an unman. A rock is an unman."
On the morning of the fight, Griffith and Matthew walked through Times Square, where men, women, drag queens, hookers, junkies and shop owners called out to him, wishing him good luck, champ. Normally, he would have stopped and spoke to his fans, but this time he just raised his fist to his people and walked on. He would be fighting for them too. Now, we have gone through this fight in great detail in our Legendary Nights episode, but in brief, on this tragic night, Emile was put down in the 6th round, and he survived and rallied on as they moved into the 12th. Griffith landed 2 short and vicious right hands that wobbled Perret backwards. Sensing an opportunity, he leaped forward, throwing another right, a left and a right, followed by another combination. Perret buckled, and in that moment, Griffith might have stepped back and allowed the champion to fall, but he didn't. He did what he was instructed to do by Clancy after round 6, and that was to keep punching until Perret holds you or the referee breaks you, but you keep punching until he does that. An uppercut made Perret sag a little more, and Griffith used his right hand to hit him again. Perret tried to hold his guard up, but his arms were too weak. They fell limply to his sides. Perret turned side on away from Griffith so that he was propped up by the ropes. Griffith now had a clear and open target of Perret's flopping head. Each one of his punches landed with force. Griffith threw the right hand again and again and again, making Perret's head rock back and forth. He used his left arm to pin Perret against the ropes, while his right uppercut connected. One punch followed another, in one of the worst visions in the boxing ring that you will ever see.
It really is difficult to watch, guys. If you haven't, I'm sure you have, but wow. Now, it's believed that there were 23 unanswered blows while referee Ruby Goldstein stood by and watched. He was frozen. He finally snapped out of his stunned daydream and then leaped between the fighters at last. Benny Perret slid down. His eyes began to close. His right arm was trapped against the ropes, while he left spread out in a surreal crucifixion. Don Dunphy, not understanding Perret's condition, then conducted an interview with Emile Griffith in the ring while Perret was on the canvas being attended to. It's just a distasteful slow motion replay was actually shown as well during this interview, and the sickening finish was just watched back in slow-mo. It really is incredible. Everyone fell silent, of course, as they watched in horror while Emile repeated himself, "I just kept punching, I just kept punching." Benny Perret was taken to hospital suffering with 2 blood clots, plus evidence of swelling on the brain. Emile tried to visit Perret in hospital, but he was told under no uncertain terms that he should not visit the former champion, and that was by his team. Benny Perret's wife, Lucy, declared the referee should have stopped the fight, but I blame Griffith. He knew my husband was knocked out, but he kept hitting him. He was very mean. I know that Griffith wanted to win, but he shouldn't have tried to kill my husband. A few days later, and Emile told the press, "The last 2 nights, I just sleep and wake all the time. I don't know if I even want to be champ now. It seems like it just means trouble. I wanted to win back the title, but not like this. It's turned into a nightmare. I'm sorry about Perret. God knows I'm sorry about Perret." He was then questioned as well about his rivalry as well, and he said, "We've been feuding since our second fight. Perret was trying to needle me, but I've never hung around with queers. Why am I going to hang around with queers for when I'm in the public eye? Or even if I wasn't in the public eye?"
Emile elaborated and said, "The first time we fought in Miami, and we were perfect gentlemen, I went to Perret's camp to take pictures. No bad remarks were made. He came to my camp to take pictures. No remarks. But we came up to New York, and that was it. He set about trying to needle me. It wasn't right." The press wanted to know what he had been thinking in those last fatal seconds while hitting Perret, and Emile sadly replied, "My mind kept saying, 'You're looking good now, just punch, punch, punch.' I didn't know what I was doing." Emile looked as if he was about to cry, as in desperation he turned to his trainer and shouted, "No, no, Clancy." The whole thing sounds so bad. The kid's lying up there, and I'm talking about how I felt. Clancy stood up and removed Emile from the room and addressed the press himself and said, "They talk about his clothes. Why? We buy our clothes at the same tailor, Gay Puros and Central Park West, and nobody makes cracks at me. It's just that Emile's got that damn 26-inch waist and 44-inch chest. Emile's just a sweet and innocent kid and a great world champion. He's caught between two worlds, but it ain't what Perrette or anyone else suggests. They all got it wrong." His friend, Buddy Garavente, who was Frank Sinatra's cousin, chipped in to support Gil and Emile, as did Sid Martin, Clancy's assistant trainer, who spoke even more forcefully and said, "This boy is a normal boy. There's nothing wrong with him. And all those stories about him being a millionaire, that's just a lot of publicity too." And he continued and said, if they had any real evidence that Emile isn't normal, it would have come out by now. But they don't. It's just names and hints and talk. People ought to know better.
Well, a lot of the talk seemed to point to Emile being gay rather than obviously Perrette, who was dying in hospital. That is the important thing here. Boxing was now being called to be abolished, obviously. The editorial of the New York Times actually wrote that the question everybody is asking is whether this fight was allowed to go on too long. A better question might be whether it or any other professional prize fight should be allowed to start. So all those questions were coming up. We did speak about this in our Legendary Night episode. Emile broke down when he read letters that actually accused him of being a heartless killer and sometimes a murderous faggot. He received abusive calls in his hotel suite from unknown people who asked him how it felt to have killed a man. Benny Perrette was not even dead, and they had him down for homicide. Even actually, potentially, he could have gone down for it as well, the way things were being heated up and discussed. So Hispanic fight fans actually gathered outside his hotel to shout out their tirade against the devastated world champion. Gil Clancy read to him the response from Willie Terrell in Johannesburg, who had spoken to the New York Herald Tribune. Emile, after he read it to him, Emile hugged Clancy and said, "Only Willie knows how I feel," and he really appreciated it. In the early hours of April the 3rd, 1962, at 1:55 a.m, Benny Kid Perrette died. Emile quit boxing after how his wife died not long after Perrette. He had enough of the death that surrounded him. At first, he started drinking heavily. For the next few weeks, he went helplessly between his house and his hideaways near Times Square, between Matthew and Esther, between drunken delusion and despair. Jim Murray wrote in the Los Angeles Times that the tragedy of Benny Perrette is the tragedy of Emile Griffith too, which is spot on. Clancy tried to ease his pain with the letters, the well-wisher letters, but nothing worked until a letter arrived from South Africa. It came from Willie Terrell. His words broke down barriers for Emile, and this is how it read.
"Champ, I wanted to write to you for a few days now. Ever since I heard the news about Benny Perrette, you are on my mind. I can't think of anything else. I know how you feel. It happened to me as well. I accidentally killed a man in the ring one night. 6 years ago now. Hubert Essico was a friend of mine. To do what I did to anyone, never mind a friend, felt the worst thing. It almost ruined me until I realised it could have happened to me. I could have been the one that went. It was just bad luck that it was Hubert. It's the same with Perrette and you. It was a big honour for me to fight you in Madison Square Garden. I know you beat me in the ring, but you were good to me before and afterwards. I always remember that, and I want to say thank you. Accidents happen, champ. They're not always our fault. This is not your fault. I want you to understand that. It took me a long time, but I got to work out in the end that it wasn't my fault either, that Hubert died. It just happened. I learned how to forgive myself, Emile, and you must do the same. You and me have to learn to roll with the punches in this life. They are often harder to deal with than the ones we got in the ring. But we can do it. I think I did it, and I know you will do it too. Good luck, champ. Your friend, Willie Terrell." Emile could not shake Willie's letter from his head that he had written so simply and movingly, that Emile could finally believe others were also genuine in forgiving him for the fate of Benny Perrette.
Emile could only say them out loud 42 years later in 2008 to his friend Ron Ross, a writer, a deeply compassionate man. And he said, "I keep thinking how strange it is. I kill a man and most people understand and forgive me. However, I love a man and many say that makes me an evil person. To so many people, this is an unforgivable sin." Griffith managed to pull himself together, return to the gym. In one of the first sessions back, Clancy actually invited Howard Tuckner of the New York Times, and he wrote, "The fighter sat in a wooden chair and stared at his hands. How many times he had done this since the night on March 24th, 1962, he cannot say. But the fear is always the same. There will come another night when a man will knock on his dressing room door and shout, 'You're on, champ.' He will walk down the aisle to the ring in his silk bathrobe and pray that nobody yells, 'That's Griffith the killer.'" When Tuckner read those words out loud to Emile, the fighter said, "If it happens, I'll just try not to hear it. I did not mean to kill him. God knows this." He admitted to Tuckner that he dreamed of Perrette and that he sometimes saw Benny standing at the end of his bed. In his own words, he said, "He was all dressed up and I said, 'Hi, how are you doing? What are you doing here?' He didn't answer." Gill told Tuckner that boxing had been good for Emile. It enabled him to bring his family together and to take care of them. His life must go on for the sake of theirs. He went on to say that in the few months, Emile will fight again and he won't be a layup. He feels that a title fight will be best.
Clancy said that a real test would force Emile to go all out and stop him thinking too much about Perrette. Not long after, Griffith began preparing to defend his world title against Ralph Dupas at the Las Vegas Convention Center on July the 13th, 1962. But before he could re-enter the ring again, Emile had been compelled to testify under oath at an official investigation into boxing on May the 22nd, 1962. He was asked whether he would be able to set aside his memories of Perrette and concentrate on his next challenger. Emile said, "I hope so, but I guess I won't know until I get in there. I know in my heart that Benny's death was an accident, but I'm still a little uncomfortable in the ring. In training, I know what I want to do, and sometimes I can do everything, and sometimes I can't." Gil Clancy, also uncertain, said, "Emile has worked hard, and he is in excellent condition, but how he will react against Dupas is anyone's guess. I don't know. Emile doesn't know. We'll only find out on July 13th. The trainer then paused, and then changed course and said, "There's one thing everybody has overlooked. They're all asking about how Emile will feel. But what about the other fella? How's Dupas going to feel?" Pat Putnam of the Miami Herald called up Dupas, who was trained by Angelo Dundee and had already set up camp in the Dunes Resort in Vegas, and he wrote that Dupas's answer was a harsh, mirthless laugh that grated down the telephone line. Perrette was a dead man before he ever climbed into the ring with Griffith, the 26-year-old said. Gene Fulmer beat him so bad that Griffith fought a dead man. If he thinks he's fighting another Perrette, he's got an awful surprise coming. Dupas was not known as a puncher, had to be anxious at the thought of the danger that he would confront.
Well, the easiest way to stop Emile constantly thinking of the Perrette fight was for Clancy and Howie Albert to refuse all interviews, so a blanket ban on all newspaper interviews was implemented. Instead, the press gathered around his opponent. He was asked about the champion's sexuality, and Dupas answered, "You know what? Griffith might be a millionaire, but he is all man." Just before the fight, Clancy and Howie allowed Emile to spend time with Jim Murray of Los Angeles Times. So they picked Murray basically to do this interview. And the champ expressed his mindset going into this Dupas fight. And he said, "I have not yet come to terms with it. I am not a saint, but I have prayed a lot. I have 8 people to support, and I have no other profession. So I've got to go on. I know I'll be fighting myself as well as Dupas in that ring. But I've talked to Sugar Ray Robinson and other fighters who caused tragedies. They've explained that it's not like I was driving drunk and killed someone. Sugar Ray says it's not as if I was a killer or a murderer. Gilbert Rogan of Sports Illustrated wrote this on the fight. He said, all told, Griffith got in the heavier blows and more frequent and made a smart fight of it. When Dupas tried, sapped by his own razzle-dazzle and the accumulative damage of Griffith's right, Emile showed his power. In the 15th round, Griffith landed a right hand which collapsed Dupas back into the ropes. Griffith followed with a succession of rights and an occasional left, banging the fading Dupas about the ring. Although Ralph was literally hanging on, Emile could not put him down, and referee Frankie Van got between them and the chance was gone. It was all, despite all Dupas did, an easy win. It was also clear from that report that Emile had Dupas in trouble at one point, but he hesitated and he backed away. Clearly, those demons are still fresh in his mind and still raw.
Emile confirmed his hesitation to Gilbert Rogan and explained his emotions at the acceptance he received from the Vegas crowd. He said, when I got such a reception from the crowd, I felt like crying. But I wouldn't let myself, even if I just felt like letting all the water come out. I thought about Benny in there. In the 15th, when I had Dupas in the corner, I stopped and looked at him and I stepped away, but instinct took over most of the time. Time, they will tell me, is a great healer. The more fights I have, I pray and I hope that I will forget. Rogan also described a somber moment. Emile said, now will you all keep quiet a moment? Dressed in only his underpants and a pair of rubber sandals, Emile walked to the far corner of the locker room. He knelt down and rested his forehead against the peach-coloured seat of a folding chair. Emile prayed silently for over a minute. All right, he said as he got up off his knees and looked at everyone. You can all start screaming again. While at the Thunderbird Casino celebrating his victory, Emile told reporters, I still think about Perret. He comes into my head all the time. I can be training in the gym and I suddenly think of what happened. I don't know if I can ever be free of it. Emile would never be free of it. No doubt time healed his pain, but he was struggling emotionally. He even suffered from flashbacks when walking around the streets of New York, thinking he could see Perret in a crowd. He would call out to him. Author Donald McRae described Emile's recurring dreams involving an empty seat.
He wrote, Emile would see himself entering a packed movie theatre. He would walk down a dimly lit aisle, searching for a place where he might sit before the movie started. Eventually, he would spot an unoccupied seat. A shrouded figure would call out his name and push down the empty seat for him. Emile would walk quickly in his dream, relief seeping through him. He would settle down, and just before the theatre went black, he looked at the man in the adjoining seat to thank him. The figure nodded and stretched out a hand to clutch his arm. Emile felt the coldness of the clasp. It was Benny Perret, smiling knowingly at him. Emile always woke up drenched in sweat. Well, sometimes the dream would be at Madison Square Garden, where he would be sitting next to Perret at ringside watching their fatal fight together, while the ghost of Benny Perret would laugh all the way through it. And it was always the moment they entered that decisive 12th round that Emile would wake up screaming. With these demons following Emile when he was awake and when he was asleep, it's incredible to think that he fought on for another 15 years at championship level. Gil and Howie kept him busy in the ring, fighting at middleweight now. They felt that if he moved up in weight, his power wouldn't be as powerful, so that was their theory behind it. He was terrific at the weight, and 5 weeks after he had beaten Dupas, Emile outpointed Denny Moyer in a non-title fight in Tacoma, Washington. ABC then screened a non-title fight at Madison Square Garden between Griffith and Don Former, the brother of Jean, the first time Emile returned to the Garden since the Perret fight. The only request from Emile in the contract was that he didn't want to use Perret's locker room nor fight out the same corner in which he had lost his life. He went on to outpoint Former on October the 6th, 1962, but it wasn't necessarily his opponent that gave him trouble. It was those demons again.
When Former backed into the Perret corner, Griffith wouldn't allow himself to go near it. He said after the fight, "I did not see Former there. I saw the late Benny, and I could not get myself to go in there." His next fight was the headliner against Ted Wright in Vienna, Austria for the first world light middleweight title, recognised by the Austrian Boxing Board of Control, but by no other agencies. On the same card was Sugar Ray Robinson, the first time in 22 years that he would fight on an undercard. Robinson knocked his opponent out in the first round, while Griffith outclassed Wright in an easy victory on points to become a two-weight world champion, of sorts. Escaping to Europe and being with his idol Robinson gave Emile an epiphany that he would like to be more like him. He loved his pink Cadillac, his fur coats, gold chains and snazzy suits, so he decided that he wanted to imitate his hero. Emile Griffith then returned to Las Vegas for his final fight of a tragic year and stopped Jorge Jose Fernandez in the 9th round of their world welterweight title fight. He followed up his first European excursion in Vienna with a trip to Copenhagen, Denmark, where in February 1963 he stopped Chris Christiansen in 9 rounds, the first defence of his light middleweight title. Emile went back down to welterweight for a rematch with the ugly one, Luis Rodriguez, who was still affected by Benny Perret's death. He wanted to beat Griffith for what he did to his compatriot and to show the world that he was the best welterweight in the world, which had now been split into 2 separate organisations, the WBA and WBC. On March 16, 1963, in Los Angeles, Griffith and Rodriguez were the headline act in a triple-header bill called the Carnival of Champions.
And this included Davey Moore's world featherweight defence against Sugar Ramos, and the third bout was battling Torres against Roberto Cruz for the newly vacant junior welterweight world title. However, with a full house at the Dodgers Stadium and 40 minutes before the first fight, promoter George the Greek actually postponed the Carnival of Champions. 4 days later, on a Thursday, the card was back on. It was a close fight, a lot closer than the first, as this is the fight of Griffith, and Griffith landed the heavier single shots while Rodriguez was flashier with his punches in the closing half of the rounds. The United Press polled 17 writers, and after the fight, 8 scored for Griffith and 7 for Rodriguez, and 2 scored it a draw. You just couldn't separate these two. The official result was a unanimous decision for Rodriguez. Albert moaned, "This is the second time they took the title away from us without a gun." Clancy asked, "How can a man win a title when he runs away? Rodriguez is a safety-first fighter, and he won the title running. Yeah, he fought hard in the last 10 seconds of every round, but what about the other 2 minutes and 50 seconds? The wrong guy got the decision. What can you do? It's boxing." Emile Griffith said sometime after the fight, "I thought I won that fight, but it wasn't one of my better performances. I landed some good body shots, and I could feel Luis give way. Each time I trapped him in the corner, Luis would grab me tightly in a clinch. This time, I hope to fence him so he can't get out of that corner, basically." However, this was not the most significant moment of the night. This was the same night that Davey Moore slipped into a coma and never woke up. He died in the early hours of Monday, March 25th, 1963. Another death in the ring.
In the weeks leading up to the Rodriguez rematch, Emile was asked about the death of Davey Moore, and he admitted, "If Moore had fought before me instead of after, I would have never have gone on." Now, Emile was guaranteed $37,500 compared to Rodriguez's $40,000 when they met again at Madison Square Garden for their third meeting. If he defeated Rodriguez, he would become the first boxer to win the world welterweight title on 3 separate occasions. At the weigh-in, photographers urged the fighters to move their heads closer together in the traditional face-off. Griffith said, "If we do that, we'll be kissing each other." Dundee told Rodriguez, "Don't pay any attention to him, he's just trying to give you the eye." One of the reporters asked Griffith, "You were giving him the voodoo eye, weren't you?" The former champ responded, "I was not. I was giving him the grim face. We'd had enough of laughing and good fella stuff. I wanted him to know how I really felt. Grim. Very grim. It'll be a grim business tonight." There was no knockdowns, but the contest fulfilled Griffith's prediction of a grim affair. In a mirror image of their first 2 bouts, the grueling third was completed by a fight so close that there was disagreement again over the scoring. Apart from the 7th, which Rodriguez dominated with counterpunching, and the 10th, in which Griffith hurt the Cuban, an argument favouring either fighter could be made after most rounds. The majority of ringside reporters scored the fight in favour of Rodriguez, but the verdicts that counted from the 2 judges and the referee gave the fight to Emile Griffith by split decision. An ecstatic Emile took Addy's round face in his hands and kissed him on the forehead.
And then he told Don Dunphy, "I thought I had the fight won all the time. I pressured him. I hurt him with the most punches. And all he would try to do was get me with one punch. The right hand over my jab." Not only had Emile written his name into the history of the sport, he also managed to gather enough money for the 17 people that relied on him winning. Now, apart from his mother, 4 sisters, 3 brothers, 5 nieces and 3 cousins, he still looked after Matthew. The 10-bedroom house in Hollis, Queens was bursting with people. How he tried to keep track of all the money that he was squandering on others. And he worked out that 4 times the amount Emile spent on himself was consumed by everyone else. Emile just shrugged it off. He didn't care. If anyone wanted money, Howie should give it to them. Howie did convince him to buy a home along the shores of the Hudson River and across the water from Midtown Manhattan. Emile enjoyed decorating that house in outrageous decor, camp refuge for him and Matthew. Emile Griffith was announced as the Fighter of the Year by the Boxing Writers Association in early December 1963. After beating Luis Rodriguez in their rematch, Griffith defeated Holly Mims and Jose Gonzalez. The 3-time world welterweight champion was due to receive his reward in January. But before then, on December 20th, 1963, he had to face a certain Reuben Hurricane Carter in Pittsburgh. The title went on the line for this fight, by the way. Now, after 1 minute and 40 seconds of ferocious fighting, Carter landed a vicious left hook to the body that dropped Griffith in a heap. Battling for breath, he got back to his feet. Heavy combinations made Griffith sag to the canvas. Again, he got back to his feet at the count of 8. But while he was still trying to understand what the hell had happened, referee Buck McTurnan stopped the fight.
It was the first time Emile had been stopped in 42 fights and 5.5 years as a professional. As the fighters embraced, the commentator suggested, "A left hook sent Emile to dreamland, and he never quite recovered from it. Griffith is a real good sportsman after such a shock." 23 nights later, on January the 12th, 1964, Emile accepted his Fighter of the Year award for 1963 at the Americana Hotel in New York. He gave a speech to the audience and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, a funny thing happened to me on the way here. I met a guy named Reuben Carter, and he looked down at me and said, 'Get up, Griffith. That ain't no place for the Fighter of the Year.' The boxing writers loved his honesty, and it took more than a minute before Emile could continue. And he said, 'I have some awards to give out to my managers Gil Clancy and Howie Albert, and my cornerman Sid Martin. They are extremely uplifting awards. In fact, they will be known as the Uplifters of the Year, and that is for lifting me off the canvas in Pittsburgh without dropping me once.'" From early February to mid-April 1964, he fought 3 non-title fights in Australia, a third-round KO of Ralph Dupas, a no contest against Carlo Duran, and a 4th-round knockout of Stan Harrington. When he returned home, Emile's life outside of the ring went pear-shaped when he heard that Matthew had tried to run over his younger brother Franklin for his constant criticism for being homosexual. They eventually split, although it was Matthew who put an end to their relationship. Inside the ring, Emile Griffith and Luis Rodriguez completed their rivalry with a 4th meeting in Las Vegas on June 12, 1964. Before the fight, Rodriguez threatened, "I am not a dancer, I am a matador. I will kill the Black Bull."
Well, Griffith was infuriated. He said, "It's not a matter of race. It's the word he used, kill. Kill the Black Bull? Has he forgotten my accident with Benny Perrette? Or does he really want to taunt me? Well, the bull will chase him down." On the night of the fight, Emile began to display the glitz and glamour for this fight. That glitz and glamour that he sort of picked up from Ray Robinson. To an extent, it goes a bit further. But Hudson Horn, the Sports Illustrated writer, was amazed. He wrote, "Emile, exuding aplomb, came into the ring wearing a white twill robe with turquoise velvet collar and cuffs. When he drew on the flamingo pink boxing gloves, the effect was startling." Journalist Jerry Eisenberg wrote this on the fight. He said, "These two have fought 55 rounds and are no closer to a decision than when it all began 4 years ago. They tried hard to end it, and all they got was 2-point spread, and one of those points came off Rodriguez's scorecard for striking low in the second round. They have fought 4 times, and Griffith, the puncher, has yet to take his man out. Rodriguez, the boxer, has yet to dance and sting and hook Griffith into submission. It was another aggressive, dirty battle, and the result was once more a split decision, but this time again for Emile Griffith." An elated Emile spoke of his opponent in glowing terms when Don Dumfries, who suggested, "During the fight you seemed awfully mad at Rodriguez, and he was awfully mad at you, but now you're saying the nicest things about him." And Emile countered, "No, Don. He was man enough to apologise to me in the ring for what he said before about wanting to kill the big black bull, and I am man enough to accept his apology." By September 1964, Emile was actually sipping tea in the Stork Club on Swallow Street in London while listening to Frank Sinatra and sitting next to him as well.
The famous singer and boxing fan tried to persuade Clancy and Albert to let him buy a share of Griffith's contract. They refused. No one else understood Emile or cared as deeply for him as a boxer and as a man, and they didn't want to upset what they already had. Sinatra's daughter Nancy, his mother Dolly, to his cousin, Buddy Garavente, were all besotted with the world champion. Dolly invited him regularly to dinner in Hoboken, where she would feed him pasta and tiramisu between fights. When he fought in Las Vegas, Nancy and her husband Tommy Sands wore matching tops with Emile's name stitched on the back, as if they belonged to his entourage. To say life was good would be an understatement. He was enjoying English tea and friends with Frank fucking Sinatra, as his buddy Calvin used to say, while in the Stork Club in the heart of London. They were in London for a fight against Brian Curvis, but before the bout on September 22nd, 1964, at the Empire Pool in Wembley, London, Emile went to the first joint press conference with the Welshman at White City Stadium Sporting Club in West London. One of Fleet Street's finest muttered out loud, "He's a bleeding iron." Now, if anybody didn't know what bleeding iron means, it's actually a Cockney rhyming slang, so it's shortened from iron huff to puff. That's basically what the insult was, if anybody didn't already know that. Well, just before the fight, Curvis told his terrified wife, Barbara, "I have a date with a killer, Emile Griffith." She replied that she would not be coming to the fight. No way. Curvis tried to reassure her, but the killer's lost all his killer instinct. Well, Griffith showed power, but lacked the finish, knocking down Curvis 3 times in the 6th, 10th and 13th. Yet each time the Brazilian challenger got back to his feet and managed to finish the fight.
Harry Carpenter was on commentary duty for the BBC, and he described Griffith as the boogeyman, silencing over 10,000 spectators with his destructive performance while Sinatra watched on from ringside. When the scores were read out, Griffith was a clear winner, who then presented a nice bonnet to Mrs. Curvis. So after the fight, when reporters entered the dressing room for an interview with the world welterweight champion, they actually found him sitting on the lap of Calvin, and they were French kissing each other. Not that it would matter too much today, but in these days, it wasn't good. Homosexual behaviour between consenting adults in private was no longer a criminal offence, but not in public. Obviously, this was in public. Emile, without no top on, was absolutely oblivious to his visitors until Reg Gutteridge broke off their passionate kiss with a little cough. During the interview, that kiss was never mentioned in print until sports writer Alan Hubbard wrote about it after Emile died. Emile and Calvin left that stadium together to hang out with the Sinatra gang at the Stork Club, but after that they headed off to Soho, which they knew was the perfect little spot for a good night out on town. So he was back in London though, not long after, 9 weeks after Emile Griffith, to stop Dave Charnley in the 9th round, back also at the same Wembley ring. Now, Emile was as active as ever, and he fought 8 times between January 26, 1965 to February 3rd, 1966, losing 2 decisions in non-title fights, one to Manuel Gonzalez and the other to Don Fulmer. Griffith had already beaten Fulmer, and when it mattered in the final defence of the world welterweight title, he outpointed Gonzalez decisively on December 1965. He travelled to Houston, Honolulu, Salt Lake City, Fresno, London again, and Las Vegas once more, while squeezing in a trio of trips to his home at Madison Square Garden. Emile was again voted the Fighter of the Year in 1965. By then, he had clocked up a career record of 56 fights, 49 wins, and 7 defeats.
He then tried to make history by becoming only the 3rd welterweight champion after Sugar Ray Robinson and Carmen Basilio to jump a division and take the world middleweight title. Griffith relinquished his beloved welterweight title to challenge Dick Tiger for his middleweight strap. Although Tiger had more power, being naturally the bigger guy, Griffith gave away £10 to defeat a highly respected and great middleweight champion. He boxed like a master, in cleverly and skillfully outboxing the strongman from Nigeria for the most part, and became the first man to deck Tiger in the 9th round on April the 25th, 1966 at the Garden. That victory made Emile Griffith a world champion for a 4th time after 15 close rounds. Emile went on the Ed Sullivan Show, and after he sang impressively, the New York Post confirmed the new middleweight champion signed a lucrative contract with Columbia Records. He would go on to release the single Going, Going, Gone in 1968. Now, incredibly, the king of the 168-pound division was losing money quicker than he was earning it. Tim Moriarty wrote in the Jersey Journal, after 57 professional fights, including 12 title bouts, you'd figure the flashy Virgin Islander was a wealthy man. He isn't. That's the primary reason Griffith has agreed to make the first defence of his newly won middleweight crown against Joey Archer at Madison Square Garden on July 13th. Emile needs the money to buy more suits, more paintings, more jewellery, and to keep those 13 hungry relatives living in the manner to which they have become accustomed. Generous to a fault, that's Emile. In addition to caring for his large family, he is also a soft touch to any guy with a hard-luck story. He has reached a point where he must keep fighting in order to pay all his bills.
Tim Moriarty actually continued, he said, other bouts are being lined up fast for Emile, who needs all the money he can get his hands on to pay for those Italian silk suits and to keep the wolf from his relative's door. Well, Griffith went on to beat Archer on points to retain his new title twice, actually, once by majority decision and then unanimously. It was his outrageous lifestyle and now less protected sexuality that was soon the subject for many newspapers and magazines. He now refused to disguise his sexuality as much as he did before and would end up in gay bars near the Port Authority on 8th Avenue or down Greenwich Village. It was actually rumoured that after fighting at a garden, we're not quite sure which one, but on a main event, he would actually show up in the bars wearing his boxing trunks, shoes, no shirt and a mink coat. He was caught once during a police raid, but when they found out who he was, they too protected him, just like the boxing world did, to an extent. The papers described his poodle, his camp decor, and his dress sense, and Sports Illustrated's feature headline says it all you need to know about what he was like at the moment, calling it Camping Out with the Champ. So Milton Goss, who actually wrote this article, thought Griffith was courteous, gentle and gracious. But Gil Clancy, sitting in on the interview, said he can also be bitchy. The slightest thing can set him off. We can have some violent arguments. About 10 minutes later, he's forgotten them. He laughs easily, he cries easily. And Emile protested, I'm not a butterfly you can put a pin in and study. I'm still like a little baby, but I'm a grown man. Gross went on to write about his eagerness to spend money. He says, sometimes it seems to be a race between Griffith and his mother to see who can spend money the faster. He has more than 50 suits. He's got 8 tuxedos. He owns 5 heavy 18-karat gold bracelets, 2 of which spell out Emile in diamond chips.
Gross wrote that he has more fancy sports jackets than he remembers, at least 25 pairs of shoes and 2 dozen sweaters. He drives a tan 1966 Lincoln convertible, complete with tape recorder, stereo and TV. His extravagance that he had learned from Ray Robinson was now in full swing, and Emile was enjoying life, something that must have been a million miles away in 1962. That night was never far from his mind, and he told Gross, you know where I got the idea for these bracelets? I saw one on Benny's hand once, and it looked so nice there. Emile Griffith, Calvin Thomas and Freddie Wright, another special friend he met a few years back, became known as the Three Musketeers in Times Square. Bottles would sometimes be thrown at them when they turned into a gay club, and a homophobe would yell, hey you nigger faggots, we know what you're doing in there. The Musketeers just ducked and laughed. They knew that no one would yell faggot if they came face to face with Emile and recognised him. Emile's next defence was against the Italian, Nino Benvenuti, who boxed brilliantly during their first world title contest in April 1967, which was awarded the Ring Magazine's Fight of the Year. Benvenuti floored Griffith in round 2. The champion got up, and in the 4th, he knocked down Benvenuti with an overhand right. Griffith had a glaring opportunity to stop the Italian, but he was not fast enough, and Benvenuti recovered. That failure to capitalise cost Griffith his title and caused him weeks of misery. Life as a former champion was unbearable, and he said, I feel naked without my title. His disappointment accounted for his unusual, temperamental mood in the build-up to the rematch 5 months later.
A reporter from the Chicago Defender asked him before the rematch on September the 29th, 1967, are you going to give Benvenuti a good fight this time? Emile growled, no, I'm going to make love to him. I'm going to go and put my arm around him and we'll do a little waltz. What do you think? Well, reporters were constantly giving Griffith an excuse. They actually suggested that he hadn't trained well enough for the first fight and they actually took him too lightly. Emile was irritated just in general by that defeat especially, and he scoffed, I'm going to be much better. I was bad last time. I was right hand crazy. I didn't jab and I didn't go to the body enough. This time, I'm going to get my title back. The rematch took place at the Shea Stadium in Queens, not far from where he lived. Clancy was confident that Griffith would regain that title, praising his work ethic and training habits. But if Griffith doesn't give me what I want this time, I'll slap him. Clancy warned one reporter for the New York Times. He hates it, but it wakes him up. I did it to him in the amateurs, and he knocked the guy out of the next round. I did it to him in the first fight with the late Benny Perret, and he knocked him out of the next round. An Italian newspaper actually wrote after the fight that Benvenuti found himself in front of a new and largely unpredictable Emile Griffith, very different from the Griffith of last April, a bold Griffith who swung his deadly right and then struck with his precise left. Emile landed a short hook in close that shook Benvenuti in the 8th, and in round 9 he was sent down, although it was ruled a slip. After that, the Italian faded badly and went down officially off a counter right hand in the next round and took a mandatory 8 count despite his protests.
The referee strangely scored the bout even, but he was overruled by 2 judges, and Griffith became only the 3rd fighter in history to regain the middleweight title. The decider would be staged at the new Madison Square Garden on March 4th, 1968, in a double bill, with Griffith fighting alongside his stablemate, Joe Frazier. The second Garden, that Tex Rickard built, and where Perret fought his last fight, was moved into Emile's Midtown Manhattan patch. Teddy Brenner was defiant that Emile had to headline the opening night of boxing at the revamped Garden. Griffith and Frazier would be paid $175,000 each, while Benvenuti was guaranteed $80,000 and Buster Mathis $75,000. The new Garden was filled with Griffith fans, but they were matched by the huge contingent of Italian supporters who chanted "Neo, Neo." They were still trading at the bell, with Benvenuti just holding off Griffith's surging assault. It took a long time for the referee and 2 judges to check their scorecards, but finally they had a decision. Referee Johnny Lobianco and Frank Forbes both scored the fight, 8-6, with 1 round even, in favour of Benvenuti. Al Burl had it 7-7, with 1 shared round. He decided that the low knockdown meant that Benvenuti should also get his verdict. Griffith lost his world title on a narrow but unanimous decision. Emile didn't know how to do anything else for a living but fight, and so from June 1968 to August 1969, he had 7 non-title fights. He won 6, losing only to Stanley Haywood, but avenged the defeat 7 months later. On October 17, 1970, Emile returned home and outpointed Danny Perez over 12 rounds at the Lionel Roberts Stadium in Charlotte Amalie. He was on a 5-fight winning streak. After a year earlier, he had failed to win back the world welterweight title from Jose Napoles.
Yeah, the drop down in weight to the division where he'd made his name was too hard to negotiate successfully. He was in his early 30s and he lost a unanimous decision to a terrific Cuban fighter, Jose Napoles, exceptional champion. 2 nights after defeating Perez, he actually met a lady, a young girl, Sadie. He was completely besotted by her, so besotted by her that he actually asked her to marry him. And Sadie, she was shocked. "You don't even know me," she said. Emile explained, No, that's what I want. I want you. I want you to marry me. Sadie didn't say yeah, but she didn't say no either. Emile told her he'd be back as soon as he had taken care of business back home and had dispatched of his next opponent, who was Nate Collins in California. He didn't think for long about whether it'd be possible for a gay man to live happily as a straight husband with a much younger woman. But he wanted to give it a go. He wanted to try it. He wanted to tell Matthew, who had actually returned back into his life, but never got the chance. In the early hours of November 7, 1970, as Emile braced himself to inform Matthew of his decision, his boyfriend came home drunk with friends. Then a shot suddenly reverberated around the apartment. There was a cry and a brief, muffled silence. Emile ran to the living room. He saw Matthew holding a .38 revolver and his face drained in blood. He had shot one of the boys he had come back drunk with, and he was actually bleeding, but he was conscious. Matthew was crying and he told Emile it was an accident. I didn't know it was loaded. Emile called for the ambulance and the police. The wounded boy would be fine. He'd come through it, but Emile knew that he had to report the shooting. The kid was taken to hospital and Emile raised the bail to keep Matthew out of prison.
3 nights later, on November 10th, he boxed beautifully to outpoint Collins while earning a modest $12,500 purse. A few days later, Matthew met Emile at his apartment and they decided to go their separate ways. Although Emile was sad to see him leave, he was also excited about starting a new life with Sadie. He flew back and forth to St. Thomas in between fights, and he was proud to tell everyone he was visiting his future wife. Gil and Howie were thrilled, especially after the shooting disaster, that he had finally met a girl he wanted to marry. Emile was travelling to the Caribbean so often that Gil and Howie, working hard to get him a shot at the new middleweight champion Carlos Monzon, decided he had better combine fighting with his travels. They arranged a bout for him at the Lionel Roberts Stadium on March 5th, 1971, against his sparring partner, Juan Ramos. Emile went easy on him until he brought an end to the exhibition by stopping Ramos in the 7th round. Late that night, Sadie gave him the news that he had been waiting for. She said yes, and yes again. She would move to New York and she would become his wife. Emile had craved to be a family man and to have a calm and ordinary life. However, Imelda was distraught. She believed that she was losing her son. She even tried to convince Esther to come back and put an end to the marriage, but she duly refused. Emile was far closer to Calvin Thomas and Freddie Wright than anyone else, but he asked Joe Frazier to be his best man at the wedding. Less questions would be asked, of course. Calvin and Freddie understood. It made sense in the straight world. Joe even sang on the wedding night. He sang James Brown's A Man's World.
Emile grabbed a decisive victory over Nazim Max Cohen that took him to 10 consecutive wins in 21 months. The biggest names that he had beaten were the former world champion Dick Tiger in their rematch and undefeated Tom Boggs, who was knocked down twice in his home country of Denmark. He was now back as the number 1 contender in the middleweight division, and he had to go back on the road again because Carlos Monzon, who accepted his challenge, would only fight in Buenos Aires. Monzon had not lost in 7 years, and he declared, "I will knock out that old man." He was actually 29, Griffith was 33. Emile started well and led on all the scorecards, moving into the 11th, but was blatantly poked in the eye by Monzon's thumb. When he cried to the referee, the Argentine hit him savagely with a right hand. Griffith began to fade, and in round 14 the crowd got behind the champion, who was dominating. A left hook to the body was followed by a crunching right cross that made Griffith clinch desperately. Monzon shoved him away, and a series of straight rights backed Griffith into the corner. He swayed helplessly as Monzon beat him with lefts and right uppercuts. Emile was bent over and he used his arms to cover his face and head as Monzon rained down his destructive blows. The referee had seen enough and he waved it into the fight. That was it, all over. What can you say, got bashed. A battered Griffith said, "Monzon is a great fighter and a great champion. I don't feel too bad about losing because I know I lost to the best in the world tonight." Asked about retirement, Emile insisted, "I have no intention of retiring. I'm willing to fight any top 10 middleweight out there to qualify for a rematch with Monzon. I still believe I can beat him."
After his world title loss in Argentina, 8 more bouts in 20 months secured his next chance at Carlos Monzon on June 2nd, 1973, at the age of 35. He would face the champion in Monaco. Emile had fought 99 times as a professional and was at his brilliant best as he outworked the champ, fighting up close and catching him with heavy body punches. Even when Monzon landed one of his big shots, Griffith took the punch. It looked as if Monzon had begun to age in the ring. After 10 rounds, as Graham Houston reported in Boxing News, Monzon was in real danger. There was blood on the champion's white gum shield and red welts on his back where he had been forced repeatedly into the ropes. Monzon's corner was anxious. It was only in the 14th round that Monzon hurt Griffith. He unloaded a bombardment of punches that rocked and wobbled a tiring Griffith but the challenger made it through to the final bell. Emile celebrated wildly and prematurely, but a narrow unanimous decision was announced in Monzon's favour. Houston reported again. The crowd greeted the verdict, announced after a long delay with jeering and catcalling. Gil Clancy clapped his hand to his forehead in amazement. Nino Benvenuti, working for live television, explained, "If Monzon won, I don't know anything about boxing. He did nothing. Griffith made the fight." Monzon himself admitted, "The fight was the hardest of my career. I knew I had won it, but I'm going to rest for 2 days and watch film of the fight. I'll make a proper decision then if I should continue fighting." Emile was defiant. "I had him under control every round except the 14th. I'd take another crack at him, but I don't think he'd give me one."
Well, encouraged by his performance and not considering retirement, he said, "I know I can be the world champion a 6th time, even if I wait until I'm in my 40s like the old mongoose Archie Moore." However, it would be his last great performance. When Emile returned home, he found a letter from Sadie. She had gone back home to become a school teacher and wouldn't be coming back. She knew of his other life, and she still loved him, however, but they were better off separated. Emile was devastated, but he understood. They would remain friends just like with Esther. But back to the boxing, and the big purses were now gone, and he was fighting for peanuts ever since that loss to Monzon. Willie Pep described him as the last of a vanishing breed. His contemporaries are gone, dead, retired, missing, one of them fighting for freedom from a New Jersey penitentiary. Only Griffith goes on. Tonight he will fight for the 99th time, the 25th time in Madison Square Garden. His purses have amounted to about $2 million. The fight Pep spoke of was against Vito Altafermo on November the 22nd, 1974. Now, Emile fought well. He bloodied Altafermo's nose, but his blows didn't really force him back. All 3 judges gave the fight to Vito. While Emile sat quietly in his dressing room, swigging water from his polka-dotted ice bag, Tex Mull from Sports Illustrated wrote, his face, which had none of the graffiti of forgotten punches marking most old boxers, was smooth and oddly peaceful. He thought he had won, but he was not unduly disturbed that he had not. Clancy, on the other hand, well, he was pissed. They don't count body punches anymore, do they? He was hitting the kid all the time to the body, and those blind so-and-sos didn't see it. He wins the fight.
Asked why he had not attempted to stop Altafermo when he had stunned him in the first round, Emile smiled sadly. "I guess I don't have the killer instinct anymore." Imelda Griffith, sitting next to her son, started to cry. "Don't be so upset, Mummy," Emile said, as her tears fell. He offered her his water bottle. "Here, you take this, Mummy. It's not the end of the world." "What now, Emile?" another reporter asked. "I go back to work, man. Anyone who wants to fight me, I will fight. Emile Griffith is not finished." He fought his 100th fight in Cali, Colombia, 2 months before travelling to South Africa on May the 31st, 1975. He fought a young boxer, Jose Luis Duran from Argentina, and was on the wrong end of a poor split decision. Clancy cried out angrily when the 3rd judge called it 97-94 for Duran. Emile just shrugged. Griffith, the 5-time world champion, who had spent 17 years in the ring, had now become a stepping stone for an up-and-comer to get past, who was on his way to becoming a serious contender and maybe a champion. For his fight in South Africa, Emile met his good friend Willie Towell, Rory Brown wrote in the Rand Daily Mail on July 31st, 1975. 15 years ago, Emile Griffith and Willie Towell were too busy trying to punch each other on the nose to engage in idle chat. Yesterday, in a luxury Johannesburg hotel, it was all different. 2 men, worlds apart in colour and background, found time to renew an old acquaintance and reminisce over the time they tried to knock each other cold. A common bond, albeit a violent one, linked the 2 men, one a black man from the Virgin Islands, who in 17 years has won and lost 5 world titles, and another, a white South African, who has won and lost the British Empire lightweight title.
Emile lost in South Africa. His last bout and another loss came in the Stade Louis II in Monte Carlo on July the 30th, 1977, against the European champion from London, Alan Minter. He knocked Griffith down and dominated large chunks of the contest, but Emile once more rallied on by Gil Clancy, pushed himself for the final tilt of glory and won those last 2 rounds, but lost the fight. He decided to hang up his gloves not straight after the Minter defeat, but in Gil Clancy's living room. Emile, he said, his voice thick with emotion, "It's over, you're retiring." No, Emile protested. "One more fight, Clancy, against someone who's not a tall lefty." Gil shook his head. "That's it, Emile. You've got nothing more to prove." Emile only really believed it was over when Gil Clancy's voice began to crack. Gil's wife, Nancy, actually handed him a tissue and he dabbed at his one good eye. Emile had never seen his trainer cry before, and he knew that was it was over. Emile Griffith finished his career with more championship rounds under his belt than anyone in boxing history. 51 more than Sugar Ray Robinson, 69 more than Muhammad Ali. At the age of 39, with 111 professional fights, 85 victories, 23 by knockout, 24 defeats, 2 draws and 1 no contest. He was a 5-time world champion and competed in 339 rounds in 22 title bouts, a record that he holds to this very day. He was stopped only twice by Reuben Carter and Carlos Monzon, but he also fought in 26 main events, more than anyone else in the combined history of the old and the new Madison Square Gardens. Although it's been a pleasure to not speak of money-grabbing promoters or managers for once, Emile finished his lucrative boxing career with literally no money in his bank.
The truth was, Gil had not taken a full share of his purse as co-manager and trainer for the last 5 years of Emile's career. Together, Howie and Gil had been supporting Emile for a while. They were happy to keep supporting their surrogate son, but he was a proud man and wanted a job. He helped out as an assistant trainer at the Solar Gym on West 26th Street and sold his apartment to move to a cheaper place in New Jersey, but he still needed to work to pay his bills. He became a correctional officer, advising young kids who had found themselves in trouble, something he could relate to. Gil Clancy accepted a new position as the matchmaker at Madison Square Garden, and he kept the plaque that Emile bought him with his first paycheck, and it read, "To my dad Gil, the best trainer in the world, your son, Emile Griffith." Emile liked to call Gil my Irish pop, and Howie my Jewish pop. He felt lucky to have had 2 fathers over the last 21 years. They more than made up for his absent real father. Emile, 41, met Luis Rodrigo, 17. Now, although the age would seem inappropriate, they would be together for the next 33 years until Emile passed away. Emile made his first successful venture into training, working with Wilfred Benitez. Emile was in his corner when the young Puerto Rican won the WBC welterweight championship from Carlos Palomino in San Juan. He would continue to work as chief trainer when Benitez defended his title against Sugar Ray Leonard. But Gregorio Benitez took full control of his son's training once again, and Emile was out. Emile went on to train boxers, Juan Laporte being one, and worked as a bouncer at O'Hara's Tavern in Jersey City before managing a bar, Jack Miller's Pub.
He was then eerily in the corner of Wilfred Sippian when he stopped Willie Klassen at the Felt Forum. 5 days later, on November 28, 1979, Willie Klassen died. Well, Mike Jones, Sippian's manager, explained how deeply Emile had been affected by another fatality. And he said, in the fight, right near the end, he twice said, "Oh my God, I see myself in there." Well, after Laporte lost to Costa Zoo, Emile decided to pop into Times Square to pick up his latest squeeze for the evening and then visit his old mate, Freddie. But it was his day off, as in Freddy's, and Emile was a bit drunk, and he needed to get back to Queens, where he lived. And he sorted a cab and looked for a taxi. That was when something smashed him on the side of the head. He said later that it felt as if a small fireworks display had exploded deep inside his head. Emile staggered, and then a second blow caught him. The words, "you fucking faggot," raced through his buzzing head. He nailed one of the homophobes and surely knocked him out. But there were too many of them, and all he could do was cover himself up, cover his head and cover his body, and just take the beating. He felt his bones crack, he felt his skin burst open. Blood was everywhere. He was still conscious when they actually rolled him over. They took his wallet and his watch and tore off his rings and his chain and picked up his suitcase. He was left on the street to bleed out. All he could remember later was walking blindly down 8th Avenue, weaving past terrified people. He passed out and someone at last helped him. He did not know how he got home, but he got home. An ambulance took Emile to Queen's General Hospital. His kidneys had been badly damaged in the assault. They were barely functioning. He also had a spinal infection. Emile Griffith was slipping away.
He ended up in intensive care, but he pulled through. 7 months after the attack, Emile Griffith finally started to heal. At home, he could talk and walk around. He was able to dress and feed himself. Life would never be the same, but somehow he had survived. To complete this story, Louis and Benny Perrette Jr. actually ended up working in the same postal office in Manhattan. Benny Jr. would eventually meet with Emile several years later, after, in the documentary Ring of Fire, the Emile Griffith story, he hugged him and told him that he wasn't to blame for his father's death. That meant the world to him, but he could never shake his demons. Emile did admit years later, after the third Perrette fight, "I never wanted to hurt a guy again. I was so scared to hit someone. I was always holding back." Emile Griffith passed away on July 23, 2013, at a care facility in Hempstead, New York. In his final years, he suffered from dementia pugilistica and required full-time care. Nephew of Joe Fraser, Mark, remembered joining his uncle for a drive to New York to see his old friend Emile Griffith, and he said, "Emile was in an extended care facility and he could barely speak, but you could see in his eyes how happy he was that Uncle Billy dropped by." His adopted son, Luis Rodrigo Griffith, was his primary caregiver. He was buried in St. Michael's Cemetery, Queens, New York City.
So we're going to finish this episode slightly different to the rest because Emile Griffith's style is not something we've actually covered very much. We vaguely have in this episode. So we're going to do that, really. We're just going to mention what he was like as a fighter, because I don't think we really showed that. So he was a physical force, deceivingly clever, with extraordinary grit, had a relentless engine, and his body attacks were just unappreciated, as we've heard from some of the quotes from Clancy there. He worked the body more following the Perrette fight, probably because, as he put it, "I never wanted to hurt a guy again. I was scared to hit someone. I was always holding back." The footage you are able to watch of Emile Griffith online show him controlling his opponents, whether that was at range or on the inside. His jab was more of a rangefinder that eventually developed over the course of his career, and his feints and constant counter-punching assisted him in controlling the distance. He was incredibly physical, and his body, which we have mentioned in the episode of the 26-inch waist and the muscular 44-inch chest that made all those girls giddly on that shop floor, was almost the perfect boxing shape. On the inside was probably where Emile was at his best, maybe one of the best in the history of the welterweight division. He would position his head on the opponent's chest or level and nullify their best abilities, like in the second Monzon fight. Using his arms and feints, he would have peppered their bodies and look for the upstairs and look to land on the upstairs if the head ever presented itself. When he pinned opponents to the ropes, especially before that fatal Perret fight, he was savage. Griffith could transition from the inside to the outside with ease and become a threat at all ranges. Lastly, unbelievably well-conditioned endurance, which is, look at the rounds he fought. No one's ever fought them type of rounds before. He would wear down his opponents and he would constantly keep them guessing. Would he force them to the ropes? Would he attack on the inside or would he attack on the outside? Let's just face it, Emile Griffith was an absolute nightmare for anyone that ever fought him, and one of the best welterweights and the greatest fighters of all time.
Absolutely, I couldn't have said it better myself. You look at his career and you think of the Benny Perret story that we covered in Legendary Nights, but what this career profile has uncovered for us, and hopefully for you listening, is that actually he was so much more than just that guy who killed a guy in the ring. He was a welterweight champion, a very good welterweight champion. He also became a middleweight champion. He also became a light middleweight champion. Remember, it wasn't obviously as well regarded back when it was first out there, but technically on record, he is officially down as a world light middleweight champion. People argue that he is a champion in 3 separate divisions, mainly the welterweight and middleweights, but that light middleweight title is down on his record. It's there, it's in the history. So when you put that down on paper and you look at that, you think, wow, actually, this guy was a champion in 3 different weight divisions. He fought the best of his era. He really did fight the best he could fight of his era. And you look at what else he did in the sport. 1963, 1965, Fighter of the Year. You look at where people rank him in his career. You look at the Boxing Writers Association of America. You look at the Ring Magazine, who listed him as the 33rd greatest fighter of the past 80 years. If I go by BoxRec ranking, they have him at 127, which I'd probably say he's arguably a bit higher than that. But look at what he did in his career. Look at the fact that he was fighting not just against the demons that he faced after the Perret fight, but look at the demons that he was trying to internalize at times, being a gay man in a straight man's world, and the difficulties that must have caused. But the fact that he was able to eventually come past all these demons in some way, shape or form to continue his boxing career and continue his life in such an extravagant and exuberant way is just testament to what he was as a human being. And I really enjoyed going through this story. I've really enjoyed going through his career. I feel like this is one of those stories that people are going to really learn so much from, and that I hope it implores you to go out there and actually buy the book and read the book in full and read some of the other literature that's out there on him, because from doing this episode and the research for it and learning so much about his life and his career, and let's not forget the very, very horrible, harrowing beginnings that we talked about at the very start of the episode. He was raped by a man in the woods. He was raped. That is one moment we never got the opportunity to speak about because we were going to save it for the end of the show. And that's just something that, this was a man that had to go through all these different levels of adversity in his life, but yet was able to create such a legacy in the sport. And by all accounts, was such a decent sportsman and a great human being. And it's been an absolute pleasure, Johnston, to do this episode on Emile Griffith, something that we said at the start we really wanted to do after doing the Legendary Nights episode. And I'm really, really glad we've done it because I've learned so much about him. I now look at him as one of the greats. Not like I didn't before, but it's certainly solidified my opinion about him and about what he brought to this sport.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. And just going back to that very beginning as a teenager, the guy called his uncle and then he didn't want to talk about it for years. He didn't speak up about it until very late in his life. And it is very traumatic to even, you can't even imagine, how scary that must have been for him. And then to actually identify a penitentiary, a juvenile penitentiary as his saviour place, just shows you how much of a nasty piece of work his cousin Blanche was, to the shit she done to him and sit, obviously hitting him with a belt and all the whelps on his back. just to come through that alone in your lifetime and be a decent human being is difficult to do. But then to have the situation where he's a homosexual, you from 12 years old, they knew he was homosexual. That's the sort of feeling I got from his cousin Blanche. That's why she treated him so badly, because, you can identify a teenager. If you're homosexual, it's not hard to not see. You know your sexuality by that point. For me personally, that's what I think anyway. And I think that's what happened. Obviously, he had the situation as well in the shower with that boy ends up beating him up. Wouldn't allow that to escalate the way it did when he was younger with the guy. But to then go on and even then do what he does and then has a situation where he kills a man in a ring and then come back from that. I mean, he should have had more. I think they gave him 3-4 months out of the ring, Sean, before they let him back in. And he was back in Madison Square Garden in less than a year. He couldn't even go in the corner because all he could see was Benny Barrett. I mean, that was trauma. He had huge traumas in his life that he was never able to deal with ever in his whole life. And to be gay and try and hold it and try and keep it a secret, it was difficult to have endured the abuse. And I think the other thing is that he was black as well. To be a black gay man in the 50s, 60s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s is a very hard thing to do. That alone gives you some thick skin and some real fucking big bollocks. I tell you that. Got utmost respect for Emile Griffith in every way, shape and form, in terms of his life, in terms of his boxing career. I mean, what a guy. How could you not take your hat off to him? And you can understand why Gil Clancy and Howie Albert, how they stuck by him, Sean. And then even when he ran out of money and he was throwing his money at his family just scrapping off him. Let's be honest, they were just taking all of his money. But them two, the way they kept him going and right to the end, were like his surrogate fathers. I mean, the whole package of the story, Sean, is fucking brilliant, isn't it? I mean, it's like a film because just them two, like having Howie and Clancy and the way they're able to turn blind eye to the fact that society showed them that homosexuality was wrong, it wasn't normal. It was very inspiring, actually, because I do really punish managers, I punish promoters and sometimes trainers for the way they treat their fighters. But these two are a different kettle of fish, aren't they? What great guys them two were as well as Emile.
It's been a great story. Really thoroughly enjoyed covering the life and career of Emile Griffith. And if you've enjoyed this Career Profiles episode, please do go and let us know. On social media, you can find the Twitter account at career_profiles, and everywhere else we are at BTR Boxing Podcast Network. That is on Facebook, that is on YouTube, that is on Instagram, and even TikTok as well. If you are watching/listening to this on YouTube, as always, please just leave a comment below in the box and let us know what you think of the episode. Any thoughts, feelings, or opinions. We're always open to having conversations with people about them, and just hearing the general feedback on the episodes is always really appreciated. A big shout out has to go out to the patrons of this podcast as well. Because of their support, we are able to put so much more research into these episodes. We're able to get so much more literature, historical newspaper archives, things that cost us money to be able to get as much research as possible to create great life stories like Emile Griffith's. Please, if you haven't checked out patreon.com/BTR Boxing Podcast, go and have a look, because like our patrons, you could get early access to episodes like this. You could get patron-only content. You could also get ad-free versions of the episodes, so you don't have to listen to the ads throughout the course of it. So please just go and check it out. And from as little as £1.50 or around about $2, you could subscribe to us, you could support us, you could allow us to continue to progress as we've been progressing over the past couple of years. It's always been genuinely appreciated and very humbling for us that we've got people that really support us in this way. If you're not able to do that, we understand, but please like and share on social media. Send everything to your friends. Let people know about the episodes and where to find us, because all that stuff really does help us just as much. But that is it for this Career Profiles episode. We hope you've enjoyed the life and the career of Emile Griffith.